I think the United States and the European Union and the United States-European partners are very much on the same page about the situation in Ukraine. The way that we've seen the protests unfolding there has really, I think, bolstered the view that we're in a situation where there is a crisis of legitimacy in Ukrainian politics right now, which is something that happens in many other contexts. This obviously started out as a result of protests against the decision by the Yanukovych government not to sign the EU association agreement in Vilnius in November of last year. But it's moved over time, in part because of the reactions of the police who have been trying to manage the protests, and then of some violent elements within the protesters, which always happen in every protest across the world. I mean, we can see this time and time again in many different settings. There's always a violent minority who tend to become the focal point of the protests and then become difficult for the rest of the protesters themselves to manage. But as a result of that evolution, those changes in the movement, the sheer length of time that it's gone on, the reactions and counter-reactions, we've now got a situation where the protests have moved from being about the EU association agreement to really about questions about where Ukraine is heading overall, and really to become an anti-establishment, anti-government, anti-Yanukovych protest. Now, the protests are also in Ukraine not reflective of the entirety of the Ukrainian population. There's obviously a great deal of difference of opinion in Ukraine, like in other countries. The support for people being on the Maidan Square for long periods of time is mixed across the country, just like in every other protest setting. But we are in a situation now where public opinion overall in Ukraine is reflecting a desire for change and a desire for different choices. We have an election coming up in Ukraine in 2015, a presidential election. And I think the United States and the European Union and many of the member states are now focusing on how do we get Ukraine towards those elections, which are, of course, the best and really the only legitimate way of making a decision about the future. So how do we resolve this protest movement? How do we turn it in a productive, positive direction so that we can get a political process underway that gets us towards the elections, where then people will be given the full opportunity to decide on how they want Ukraine to be governed in the future? Well, unfortunately, having laid out the scenario in which we get peacefully towards elections in 2015, we're actually in a very difficult situation now, where tempers have become very frayed. We have competing narratives about what's happening in Ukraine. The protesters themselves are somewhat divided in terms of the representation of different groups. There's not one opposition figure or even two opposition figures or three opposition figures, as we had in the Orange Revolution going back into 2004, that have big bases of support. We have a lot of fractured opinion and fractured aspirations and differences of where people want it to go. So I think what we're going to have to see here is a long-ish process in which people are sitting down and trying to thrash out how we sort things out. So the most likely scenario at this point is that we have the continuation of the protests and a lot of ill feeling that is arising, and that we also then have some kind of intervention, some kind of mediation from the outside that we've had in many other similar situations, where a combination of outside representation, maybe it's through the United Nations, maybe it's through the EU and the US, or a combination of all of them, try to bring as many parties to the table as they can to find a solution. I don't think, in fact, that there is an easy solution to be found. There's no one formula for this, and we're going to have to, I think, tread very carefully. So, unfortunately, when posing the question, what do you think should be done, it's always very difficult to answer it, because a lot of it really depends on the dynamic on the ground, the way that people are expressing themselves, the demands, if you can aggregate them, of everyone, and then what the sentiment is in the rest of the country, where demonstrations have taken place in different settings, not just in Kiev. Kiev has become the focal point, but Ukraine is a very big country with a lot of different regional sentiment, and we're going to have to find a way of addressing what the people of Ukraine in their aggregate, because there's no collective consensus that's readily apparent here, what they really want to happen.